If the Iranians really wanted to have a nuclear weapon, they would have had one by now. Is this enough for the United States to mobilize and start a war with Iran? There is no evidence to suggest that the Iranians control the Houthis to that extent. On the Western side, we have a tendency to sometimes make everything a bit too black and white. Iran and all its groups, and Iran can control the actions of every single element. The fact is, it's a bit more complicated than that.
This is a conversation with Alex Vatanka, a Tehran-born expert on Iran's domestic and foreign policy, and a director of the Iran program at the Middle East Institute. In this conversation, we talk about Iran's geopolitical strategy, what is it trying to achieve, and what are its motivations and goals, but also about whether it would benefit from a larger regional war, how stable is the Iranian regime, to what extent it controls Hamas, and much, much more. Thank you so much to everyone who supports this podcast on Patreon, because you make this possible. And now, enjoy the conversation. All right, so welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
In September last year, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, claimed that basically the Middle East hasn't been this quiet in 2 decades, which today seems like basically the opposite of that is true. And obviously this has been mostly because of Hamas and its attack on Israel, but Iran seems to have played a significant role in that as well. And maybe to better understand what's been happening in the region in general, can we start by explaining what is and what has been Iran's long-term foreign policy strategy before October the 7th, and then how it was changed by what has happened, and how it then led to everything that has happened since and that we're seeing today, from attacks in the Red Sea to U.S. servicemen being killed in Jordan, and the general worsening of the situation in the region.
Great. Well, let me first say how great it is to be with you. I look forward to the conversation. On Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, he did say those words. He, in fact, wrote an article along those lines for Foreign Affairs. And then the unfortunate attack by Hamas, October 7th, happened as that article was being printed, essentially. Look, we can sit here and say, how come the United States or the person of Jake Sullivan didn't see it? The fact is, nobody saw it. That was not what was supposed to happen. That was not on the cards. It had been quiet on that front for some time. We were, if you remember, all of us much more focused in terms of the political fight inside of Israel, about the soul of the country of Israel going forward. So nothing externally was supposed to happen. And then we all know what happened on October 7th. So to your point about what was Iran's position before that attack and what was Iran's position after that attack. Look, the Islamic Republic, and I think it's important to distinguish between the country of Iran, which has a very different history with the country of Israel, and for that matter, the country of the United States, a very different public opinion inside the country that is much more positive towards the U.S. and, in fact, also towards Israel. But you have an Iranian Islamist regime in power for 45 years now, since 1979, that has a real ideological issue both with the United States and certainly with the state of Israel. Their position for about a half a century has been twofold. The United States needs to be pushed out of the region, essentially, by Iran and those other like-minded countries and groups that want to join Iran in that endeavor. And that Israel literally needs to cease to exist as a country. Now, we can debate what cease to exist means, whether that means Iran's going to take arms up to destroy the state of Israel, or if they mean something else. That's a discussion to be had. But nobody can discuss the enmity of the Islamic Republic towards Israel. Again, they have their reasons for it. We can discuss that if you're interested. They feel that Israel is essentially a Western colonial project that has deprived the Palestinians, that Iran considers the native population, deprived them of their basic rights and so forth. So that's where they're coming from. But having just laid out the sort of position of the Islamic Republic overall since it was created in 1979, that does not mean Iran's position significantly changed after the attack on October 7th. Essentially, the same game plan is in motion. And what is that game plan? The game plan is time is on the side of the Islamic Republic of Iran and its partners, groups like the Houthis in Yemen or Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas, and so on. Time is on their side. And in fact, what they have done, very much everything they could do, is to make sure they don't get dragged into this conflict. Being dragged into a conflict, essentially, from an Iranian perspective, certainly means that the United States will be forced to enter the war, and he will do so on the side of its ally, partner, whatever you want to call it, namely Israel. And that is where the Iranians see the real danger, that their actions might provoke the United States into a military conflict, which Iran cannot afford. It knows the outcome of that war before it starts. And that's why you have seen in recent weeks, and in fact months, the Iranian leadership putting restraints on some of these groups in Iraq and Syria to say, because you're close to us, if you take action against the Americans or the Israelis too much, that might force them to go after us. And that's just terrible news for all of us in the so-called axis of resistance. So let me stop there. But I think I've given you a bit of history there, 79 onwards, and the potential for change because of October 7th, which in my estimation really wasn't that significant. The game plan is a long-term one, a game of patience. And let me just end here by quoting the Iranian Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who said, Israel will come to its demise. It will do so at the hands of the Palestinians or perhaps the Israelis themselves, but not at the hands of Iranians.
One of the things that you've said and that I'd like to follow up on is basically what you're saying, that is that it's not in Iran's interests and in the interests of its allies or proxy groups to escalate the situation into a larger war, especially one that the United States would be involved in, which I completely agree with. But I find it really interesting that this concern became the main narrative in the months after the October 7th. And I wonder whether that was, on our side, a major misunderstanding of what Iran's strategy is, and that its primary goal is actually to not get dragged into a war.
The Islamic Republic's primary goal is the survival of the political system that has been there since 1979. That is its primary goal. What it does in the region is secondary. It's part of that ideological sort of mission they've been on. But whenever they've been pushed, they have taken a step back. They have never been willing to risk the survival of the system for the sake of pursuing a regional agenda. I mean, you could go back to the Iran-Iraq war, when the Iranian leadership in Tehran realized they were simply too isolated, too weak to continue that war, which they had said originally they will fight until Saddam Hussein was toppled. But when hard realities hit them, they stopped. They stopped and they agreed to a ceasefire. So you have to keep that in mind. The Islamic Republic is an entity that does very careful cost-benefit analysis. This is not some reckless, suicidal entity that goes out there and does things just for the heck of it. They haven't been in power for 45 years because they're reckless. In fact, the opposite is true. They take decisions after careful consideration. That doesn't mean those decisions are good decisions, healthy decisions, entirely separate matter, which we can debate. But on this issue of whether they should go to war with the United States or not, that's as obvious as daylight. They know the outcome of that. So I remember writing an article saying that Iran cannot afford a regional war. In fact, I think that was the title of my article, Iran Cannot Afford a Regional War, published in Foreign Policy here in the United States, just a couple of weeks after the Hamas attack. So it was very clear early on, going to your point about the narrative hasn't changed much. The narrative is this war just turned not only the Islamic world, but much of the global South against Israel. And maybe others, maybe even in the West, they're going to start thinking their position in supporting Israel is going to cost them too much. That's been the Iranian reading of the war in Gaza, and that has been true all along. And second to that is this war is going on. Let the Israelis keep digging themselves into a deeper hole, but we should stay out of it. And again, that hasn't changed. So you've seen, at times you've seen some of these attacks by groups aligned with Iran in Iraq and in Syria, taking shots at Israel, the United States. But when you saw the United States take action after the killing of those 3 Americans in Jordan, it's been silent for about a month now. And I don't think that silence is coincidental. That's very much part of the, mothership back in Tehran saying to its minions around the region, just don't do anything that, rocks the boat too much. The exception are the Houthis in Yemen, because their missile attacks on the shipping in the Red Sea has continued. But we can debate how much control Iran has over the Houthis. Because in the West, we have a tendency to, whenever we describe the Houthis, we put the words Iranian-backed Houthis. And that becomes the key word everybody sort of latches onto. Iranian-backed. That kind of, for many, means that Iran has this switch on and switch off button when it comes to Houthis. There is no evidence to suggest that the Iranians control the Houthis to that extent. Sure, they have cooperation with them. Sure, they provide missiles and drones and so forth. But the Iranians are not, Hezbollah. The Houthis are not like Hezbollah for the Iranians, right? They have their own independence as far as their agenda is concerned, their own mission in terms of what they want to be seen to be in the Arab world. And they have their long history of support for the Palestinians. So on the Western side, we have a tendency to sometimes make everything a bit too black and white. Iran and all its groups, and Iran can control the actions of every single element. The fact is, it's a bit more complicated than that.
Can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit? I guess if that's the case, what is the interest of Houthis in this situation, and why do they keep going with the attacks, and what would maybe persuade them to stop? And is it then in Iran's interests that these attacks keep happening?
Right. So let me be careful. I am not a Yemen specialist, so I would be very careful how deep I will sort of engage you in conversations about the Houthis and Yemen. Very complicated, beautiful country that I only visited once. But I can tell you that, the Houthis have their own, as I mentioned earlier, their own reasons for wanting to do this. Not only does it work well with the Yemeni population, but that has a history of a sort of very pro-Palestinian sentiment, which is obviously not unique to the Yemenis. You find that in many parts of the Arab world, if not almost all the Arab world. But they also managed to turn this issue into essentially a positive PR campaign on their part. I mean, how many people around the world spoke about the Houthis a few months ago, right? We only started talking about the Houthis once the shipping and international trade was put at risk or slowed down in the Red Sea. So they have put themselves on the map. Now, that's leverage. How they're going to use that leverage, you really need to talk to somebody who is much more keen observer of Houthi political process than I am. But you can't deny the fact that they have put themselves on the map. And that might just turn out to be something they can use both in terms of their domestic power consolidation against their rivals in the south or others inside of Yemen. And in terms of your question about the Iranians, look, the Iranians, I'm sure, like the fact that the Houthis were able to internationalize the conflict in Gaza. This was the biggest, splashiest aspect of that internationalization, right? And I'm sure the Houthis couldn't have done it without support from Iran and Iranian, pro-Iranian organization, most notably Hezbollah in Lebanon. I'm sure there's training, there are, technical advice being provided. So and as you heard, U.S. Navy has been saying for some time that the Iranian naval forces in the Red Sea around the Bab al-Mandeb have been providing intelligence in terms of which ships the Houthis should attack and so forth. So, but put all that aside. Yes, Iran benefits because the Gaza conflict becomes internationalized. And from Iranian perspective, why does Iran want it to be internationalized? Two reasons. One is put pressure on Israel. The Iranians love to give Israel the worst possible image that they can give Israel. And so when people start putting two and two together and saying attacks on shipping in the Red Sea and my goods coming late for Christmas is to do with what Israel's doing in Gaza, that kind of sort of might work from Iranian perspective. But number two, the Iranians have been trying from very beginning of this conflict in Gaza to salvage as much of Hamas military capacity as possible. So when the Houthis are putting pressure on shipping by attacking them, what are they asking for in return? They're asking for something very specific, a ceasefire in Gaza now. Their bottom line is if Israel stops its military operations in Gaza, then the attacks on the shipping will stop. That very much is also what the Iranian regime wants to see, because again, that is how you salvage as much of the Hamas military wing as possible. Because remember, Iran's regional strategy, this operation of the proxies in the region, these proxies are operating in different theaters, but a key theater for Iran is Gaza, because that's the southern flank. That's from where Iran has been able to put pressure on the Israelis by arming groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad, much smaller group, but nonetheless an Iranian ally. Anyway, I'm getting too much into the weeds, perhaps. Let me stop here and get your reaction.
It's really interesting, but I think talking about Iran's relationship with the groups operating in Gaza, what is at the actual relationship and mainly the extent of Iran's influence over these groups, and mainly over Hamas? Because with Hamas, after the attack on the October 7th happened, there was a lot of speculation whether Iran knew, whether Iran approved of it ahead of time, whether Iran helped to organize the attack. And I wonder to what is the core of the relationship, and to what extent is Hamas dependent or independent of what Iran wants?
So I can perhaps start by pointing to some of the history that we know. I mean, Hamas was created in 1987. It's been around for some time. The relationship with Iran doesn't really pick up to the late 1990s. That happens to be the time where Iranian-Israeli tensions are at a peak or start to go in the direction of escalating to the point where we are today. So my point in saying that is they have a common enemy, and it's called Israel. It's not necessarily any more complicated than that. I mean, yes, they're both Islamists, but very different types of Islamists. One is an offshoot of Muslim Brothers, a Sunni movement, and Iran's Shia Islamist agenda is distinct to its own. So, there is no sectarian affinity. Obviously, Hamas is Arab, Iran is Persian majority. So I can point to the differences, but let me go back to the one common issue that brings them together: enmity towards Israel. But that even when they had enmity towards Israel, they have in the last 15, 20 years shown on a number of occasions that they can part ways. Most notably, Hamas decided to walk away from Bashar al-Assad in Syria when the Iranians were very upset and said, why are you doing this to Assad, who has been housing you or hosting you? And to us, the Iranians, we're part of the same family. And Hamas packed up and left. So we've seen differences in the not recent or distant past. So that's important to keep in mind. There's a relationship here that's pragmatic. It will continue as long as it works for both sides. But let's not exaggerate how deep it is. Now, in terms of, Islamic Jihad, the much smaller group, that's one that we appreciate as analysts to have much closer, almost organic ties with the Islamic Republic, going back to 1979 almost. So much longer relationship, but also Islamic Jihad is a much smaller organization than Hamas. So again, we have to be very careful when we look at all these various proxies that we call proxies, that they're very different. They come from a point of departure in terms of history. I mean, Hezbollah, created in the early 1980s, was born in a very different Middle East than, say, the Houthis that were born 10 years ago as a movement when they took over Yemen or when the civil war in Yemen erupted. We have to be very careful that we identify these actors at the right, proper historical context when they emerged, But most important question is, why did they look to Iran? Why did they look to the Islamic Republic for support? Mostly what you'll find is they don't look to Iran for ideological reasons, but for financial and perhaps military reasons, right? So when you have a region as we have in the Middle East, where you have had so many different conflicts erupt over the last few decades, and where security vacuum oftentimes is a condition, what happens is the Iranians have been very good opportunistically to come in and offer their services, offer themselves as, the agency that can help you in your conflict in that local theater where you're fighting somebody else. I mean, we've been talking so much about the Houthis. Let's point to the Houthis. They needed somebody to come and help them out, and Iran was there. Iran helped the Houthis out, not because they liked the Houthis necessarily, not much more than any other group, but because the Houthis, again, made sense as a partner because they had a shared enemy at that moment, which was called or is called Saudi Arabia, right? So with the Houthis, it was the common enemy, Saudi Arabia. With the Hamas, it was Israel. Hezbollah, again, also Israel. And I can point to factors like this, but what I'm trying to get to is this, which I think is really the point I'm trying to make, which I think is worth underscoring. You don't have a single case in the last 45 years when the Islamic Republic of Iran was created where this regime from Tehran could walk into a part of the region that was at peace and operating nicely, and the Iranians could come in and change the political system, right? You haven't had that. The rule has been when there's a security vacuum, where your country's at war, where there are different factions looking for outside help, one faction in various arenas, as we've seen in the Middle East, has been able to look to Iran and get Iranian support. That's been how the Iranians have been successful, because of security vacuums that have presented themselves. Again, I don't want to get too much into history, but it starts with Hezbollah in Lebanon in the early 80s. And, fall of Saddam Hussein in Iraq created lots of opportunities. All these Iraqi groups that we today call pro-Iranian groups, most of them obviously born after the Saddam Hussein regime's fall. So those are examples of how the Iranians have been good at coming in opportunistically and fill a vacuum.
I think that's a really interesting perspective on both the Iranian strategy, but also how we think about the groups that we call proxy groups, and why that might not be always the most appropriate name even to call them. But I wanted to dig a little deeper on Hamas, and specifically, in your view, what's the connection between Iran and the attack on October the 7th? Did Iran approve of it ahead of time?
I have no way of knowing that. I don't think anybody really in the open source environment. I mean, that's the sort of thing that intelligence agencies, I'm sure, have assessments on and evidence thereof. But I, operate in the open sources. I rely on what I can see, available information, listen to officials' statements. And one of the other things those of us in the open source environment can do is we can see trends. We don't just look at one event and conclude our assessments based on that. We look at trajectories and trends. And when it comes to the sort of a longer term trend, as I pointed out, the two things that here to keep in mind when we answer that or try to answer that question, did Iran know? Number one is the Islamic Republic's enmity towards Israel. It's as obvious as anything, right? There's hardly a secret there. They proclaim it proudly themselves frequently. But the other thing is, to a point I made earlier, this is not a suicidal regime. It knows that Israel is backed by the United States. You've got to keep those two facts in mind as you think about, did Iran know or encourage Hamas to attack Israel? If I had to gamble and guess, I would say probably the Iranian regime, even if they knew some attack was about to happen, which is very likely, they were probably as surprised as anybody else about the scale of the devastation. because that's the sort of thing where things can get out of control, right? When was the last time 1,200 Israelis were killed on Israeli home soil, right? That's a sort of moment where Israelis like to call it their 9/11. From their perspective, why not? I mean, they had never seen devastation like this before. And the Iranians know that, when something as major as that event occurs, given their relationship with groups like Hamas in the region, that they will be very quickly perhaps be blamed, as many have blamed the Islamic Republic for its support for Hamas over the years. So I would say, I don't even know if the Hamas leadership in Doha or in Turkey knew about what the Hamas leadership in Gaza was about to do. I mean, that's the state of my knowledge, and I think that's the general level of knowledge out there, except perhaps some intelligence services that have more specific information about what happened and who knew beforehand, the 7th of October. But again, I think, we can talk about that. But here's the other reality. Even if Iran knew about it, even if Iran paid for it, I mean, I'm going out here, I'm going maximum out. Even if Iran paid for that operation, what does it do to the calculations of the United States right now, or Israel for that matter? Is it enough to start a war? Is it enough for the United States to mobilize and start a war with Iran? And the answer to that, for me, is no, right? It wouldn't even change that. It might create a new sort of sanctions regime on the part of Western countries mobilizing against Iran. But I want to touch on something that perhaps we can talk about during our conversation, which is there is a lack of Western strategic clarity when it comes to the Islamic Republic. And you need clarity before you can, use an event, even a big event like October 7th, to argue for new policy options. We don't have the clarity, and that's why we don't have new Western policy options against the Islamic Republic. That's where we are in this gray zone, this sort of hit and run operations by pro-Iranian groups in the region. The West puts more sanctions on, and when we step away, because essentially nobody wants regional war, nobody wants escalation. I guess all-out war is worse than where we are right now. But where we are right now is hardly a very comfortable position to be in either, because everybody's on the edge. Economies are suffering. People's, state of security is constantly being questioned across the region. We've seen the impact that the Gaza war has had on economies as far away as Oman, obviously nearby Egypt and so forth. So, but anyway, maybe we could talk about Western policy options at some point, but I just don't see that clarity right now. And I think that's a legacy of 20 years plus of Western interventions from Afghanistan to Iraq that frankly didn't result in good outcomes. And as a result, you have a deep Western reservation about getting involved in another conflict. And yet this time with arguably the biggest of the countries in the region, namely Iran.
We will definitely talk about the Western or the U.S. strategy or the lack thereof towards Iran, because that's extremely important. But before that, I'd like to touch on the last major Iranian proxy group that we haven't really focused on, which is Hezbollah. And specifically, I think one of the ideas that was thrown around quite a lot was that it's not in Iran's interest to engage in a larger war with Israel and the United States, but what they might do is use Hezbollah to attack Israel, and that could be a way to escalate the conflict, but not get involved in it directly. And I wonder if that kind of a thinking makes sense, and whether that is a way of thinking that someone in Tehran might have, or if that would be also beyond the threshold of acceptable risk for the Islamic Republic.
No, it's exactly what you just said at the end. It's too much of a risk. Not only that, not only because Hezbollah is so closely associated with Islamic Republic, that essentially it's very quick for the United States and the West in general to blame Hezbollah's actions on Iranian sponsorship. So the Iranians know that. And that's the position they have to occupy because of decades of support for Hezbollah. They are seen to be hand in hand. So in that sense, it's a risk. And for that reason, I don't think Iran's going to ask Hezbollah to go out and attack Israel. I don't believe that for a moment. I think there's a bigger reason for it as well, which is Iran has never intended to create Hezbollah to go to war with Israel. Intention is to use Hezbollah as a power projection instrument. Let's not forget, Israel hasn't declared it, but it's pretty an open secret that Israel is a nuclear armed country, right? So Iran is not a nuclear armed country. Iran has a nuclear program, but doesn't have nuclear weapons. So what do you do if you're Iran to project power over Israel? When a group like Hezbollah, because of proximity, right? Because this is where geography really matters. Israel is a pretty small country. I mean, Iran is about 90 times bigger than Israel. Israel is a pretty small country. Lebanon is a pretty small country, but next to Israel, whereas Iran is 600 miles away. So what the Iranians get out of having Hezbollah intact in Lebanon is they can place whatever it is, number of 100, 150,000, depending on who you ask, missiles, short range, medium range. That's all you need. You don't need long range missiles if you're firing them from Lebanon into Israel, a country of 8, 9 million people. Again, I don't want to go through the list of what Iran could do through Hezbollah to damage Israel. But that's not the point. The point, the Iranians and the Hezbollah movement, they know the Israelis know. And that creates this sort of deterrence that they have. So Israel has the nuclear weapons. Iran doesn't, but it has the missiles aimed at a relatively small country that even without nuclear weapons, you can bring pretty awesome, and I don't use the word awesome in a positive sense here, devastation upon your foe here. So that's how I see it. I again, don't take my word for it. Just listen to one of the many speeches that Hassan Nasrallah has given in the last few months. He's basically pretty much come out and said, we will do what we can do to shape the calculations of Israel, limited rocket fire into northern Israel, which, is terrible. If you're a citizen of the state of Israel, you live in the north, you have had to evacuate because of these rocket fires, but they are not a full-on scale war waged by Hezbollah. That would be a different matter. Hezbollah hasn't done it. Hezbollah is not going to do it. I think the only time, if I had to, again, as an analyst, look ahead and sort of ask myself, when would Iran ask Hezbollah to unleash everything it has at Israel, is if the United States went for regime change and military attack on the Iranian homeland. That's the only time I can see Hezbollah being fully activated, everything it has to go after Israel and whatever else the Hezbollah as a movement can get its hands on. But until that moment where there is a U.S. decision to go after the Islamic Republic in its homeland, until that moment, I don't see Iran wanted to risk losing Hezbollah. This is a project that Iran has invested in the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars per year over decades, right? They don't want to just lose that. They want to keep that intact. And that's exactly what they've done so far.
I think one last question before we move on to the topic of the Western strategy towards Iran, is the topic of nuclear weapons, specifically of Iran's nuclear weapons, because that is also connected to the issue of Western strategy. So what is the importance of obtaining nuclear weapons for Iran, and how does that fit within the larger strategy of the Islamic Republic's leadership of survival?
Right. So look, I mean, this Iranian nuclear program is been known to the world publicly since 2002. Intelligence community knew about it even before then. It's an old program. It's been around for a long time. One has to assume that if the Iranians really wanted to have a nuclear weapon, they would have had one by now. They don't, because again, cost-benefit analysis, the risks associated with dashing for that nuclear weapon. Instead, what they have settled for, and again, one can question the wisdom of this policy, but that is basically the policy they've chosen, which is to sort of become a nuclear threshold state. Everybody knows that Iran can have a nuclear weapon in a matter of weeks, if not months, but they've decided not to go all out and weaponize. And in the meantime, they are where they are, isolated, sanctioned. They're paying a very heavy price for this policy. I mean, other countries that have pursued nuclear programs and weapons, have done so at much lower costs. I mean, Iran's own neighbor, Pakistan, was sanctioned for a while, but it came out of it. I mean, the costs associated with Iran's nuclear program are staggering. I mean, it's really should be a top 20 economy in the world today, and it's not because of the economy is essentially being taken hostage by Iran's foreign policy. When we talk about Iranian foreign policy, its nuclear issues is the real matter of concern and the reason for its isolation. I don't know if Iranian strategists really have a great idea in terms of where this nuclear program is going to take the country. I might not see it. I see the costs. I think they could have done this differently. They could have a nuclear program. When you enrich to 60%, it's not for your civilian nuclear program. It's for something else. It's for leverage. But leverage to do what? And I think, it's a case of the regime in Tehran not seeing the forest for the trees, kind of getting lost in the sort of petty sort of rivalry in this process with the U.S. and the West, and in the meantime bleeding the country. So they enriched to 60% because the U.S. or the West put sanctions on them, and then if there's more pressure, then they threaten to increase even more high levels of enrichment, or even sometimes they claim or threaten to leave the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. All that is great, tit for tat, great, but to what end? And I think actually policymakers in Tehran will struggle to give you a good, decent answer in terms of what this program has done for him so far, and what it's going to bring for him in the future. Now, the one thing you will hear from the senior Iranian leadership are such things as they're, serving the national interest with pride, that this has brought Iran independence. Even that argument you can attack, because what Iran's nuclear program has essentially done is isolated the country to the extent that it's beholden to, Russia and China, essentially. That's not independence. That's putting your eggs in a couple of baskets when you could have had multiple of baskets where you could invest your future in. I mean, that's what Iran's neighboring countries are doing. I mean, can we name one country among Iran's neighboring states that don't have good relations with Russia or China? I mean, I can't think of any. They all do. But they also have good relations with the United States and the West. So, in fact, they're the smarter ones. The Saudis, the Emiratis are the smarter ones because they don't limit their options. They are taking from every source they can get their hands on, trading. Their economies are booming. Whereas Iran, you got a collapsing economy, collapsing public confidence in the future, historic rates of immigration. Everybody that can leave is leaving. And again, I mean, I could go on and point to the various costs associated with this program. And going back to your point, for what great strategic aim? And that's the missing part. That isn't there.
So talking about strategic aims, let's talk about the U.S. strategy towards Iran or the Islamic Republic. Because basically what you were saying before sounded to me like that you think that the U.S. actually doesn't have a strategy. And I wonder whether you would agree with that. And if so, then, well, I guess why is that? And what do you think that the U.S. strategy towards Iran or the Islamic Republic should look like?
Right. I'd rather not get too much into what I think should happen because that's basically policy advocacy, and I'm in a think tank. I can tell you how sort of the different options look like, the outcome of choosing one option versus another, but I leave it to others to decide what should happen. So, for example, I'm not for war. I'm not for sanctions. I'm not for regime. I'm not for any of those things, but I can tell you what's good or bad about each of them as an analyst. So, but I do have an answer for you in terms of what is American strategy on Iran right now. And I think that's been true for some time, is to do nothing, essentially do nothing. Well, you asked the question, strategic, nothing strategic. What does strategic mean in this context? It means that you decide that you want to accept the Islamic Republic with its leadership as it is, and you want to reassure them that you have no bad intentions towards them. That you start engaging the supreme leader, the Revolutionary Guard, you get them off your sanctions list, you send as many overtures as possible to convince him, look, we are not after you. Don't just look to Russia and China. Deal with us too. We might have a deal for you that you might like. That's one way. Or the opposite end of the spectrum, you decide there's no way you can offer these people the sort of overtures that will be convincing to them, that you decide my policy needs to be do everything I can to bring the Islamic Republic down. Now, it could be sanctions, it could be targeted assassinations, it could be creating new coalitions, it could be a whole host of things. But if you ask me right now which of these two end of these spectrums is the United States, I can tell you it's in the middle somewhere. And I can't tell you what it is. And there are reasons for that. It's not that the U.S. doesn't want to have a strategy. It's because it's an impossible task almost. Going back to 1979, successive American presidents have tried various options to send overtures to the Iranians, to intimidate them, and nothing's really worked. Nothing's really worked so far. And we're at a point right now where your average American politician, including the guy who sits in the White House, and I'm sure that's the case with the current occupant in the White House, it's just not worth it, right? So, let's take President Joe Biden right now. Yeah, he's in a re-election mode. Is he going to do anything to risk his re-election? Is he going to do anything on Iran? Because on the one hand, if it seems to be too pleasing towards the Iranians, the Republican side, former President Trump will say he's weak. He's giving the Iranians everything they want. The Iranians are doing the bad things we know they're doing in the region, and Biden should be held accountable. So, if President Biden starts sort of, do what he did just end of January, more U.S. military strikes against Iranian-linked targets, then the likes of former President Trump will say, "Oh, he's a warmonger." Biden is going to do what he's doing in Ukraine, create tensions and send American boys and girls to die in a faraway land for what? So it's a lose-lose proposition right now. And it's not limited to Biden. I think you go back to President Trump. President Trump spoke in very strong language when it came to Iran. We need to, punish this regime. You remember maximum pressure was, as a campaign was launched in 2018 and so forth. But when it came to actually confronting the Iranian regime militarily, even though when he killed Qasem Soleimani in January 2020, he was very clear. He wasn't going to go to war with Iran. Why? Because he knows the American public opinion is against another Middle Eastern war. So for those reasons, it's almost easier for American politicians, Democrat, Republican alike, just to sort of kick this can down the road. And that's been going on for decades now, essentially, right? So when you look at U.S. positions on, say, China or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's been much more clarity in terms of the purpose of the mission. We have to punish the Russians, get them out of there. We're going to make sure the Chinese don't think about taking Taiwan. And that sort of clarity hasn't existed really when it comes to dealing with Iran. And I think that is important. So I said I'm not a policy advocate, and I'm not, because that's not my job. But that is something that you really need to start thinking about. How much more are you going to sit here if you are the United States, you want to be the sole global power, and you're letting Iran essentially threaten your various interests in the region? How do you deal with that? Do you learn to coexist with this Iranian regime? Do you come up with an idea to replace this Iranian regime, which is a very heavy lift for anybody who wants to do it, but it's a policy option. In the meantime, if you for a second are sitting in Moscow or Beijing, you will do anything to make sure that the Americans don't get their hands on Iran, that American embassy does not open up again. Because, if you're Russia and China, Iranian public opinion is overwhelmingly pro-American. Despite what the regime in Tehran wants you to believe, the average Iranian is not against the United States. In fact, they tend to be among the most pro voices in the Islamic world. So Russia and China have a very strong interest in making sure U.S. and Iran remain at loggerheads where they are today, because that serves the interest of the Russians, the Chinese, and perhaps others in the region. So anyway, let me stop.
Sure. I'll try to sort of pick apart a little bit everything you've said. I guess the takeaway that I get maybe from what you're saying is that basically until you would be willing to commit to really costly solutions, it doesn't matter as long as you're sort of moving around the center of the policy solutions. It doesn't matter that much what you're doing until you would decide to go really towards one of the two extremes, either extremely friendly or extremely hostile. Is that sort of correct?
No, I think that definitely what you described is what I said. What you just summarized is going a good distance towards something, but that might look like a policy change. And that's, God knows this country needs a policy change because it doesn't really have an Iran policy. U.S. right now does not have an Iran policy. I mean, we have sanctions, we have these tactical agreements, we release frozen funds, they release hostages. We fire off some, missiles at one of their friends in Iraq or Syria, and they stop firing at us. But these are all very tactical. They sort of happen weekly, monthly. But year on year, that hostility has remained. And to change that hostility, to turn it around, to do something fundamental about it, is exactly what you and I are talking about, which is you got to decide. Do you want to invest in regime change policy? Do you want to invest in convincing this Iranian regime that actually U.S. policy isn't to kill the Islamic Republic off, but to push the Islamic Republic away from hurting American Western interests? So that's where but this is only on one side of the equation, because it takes two to tango. And the fellow who sits in Tehran, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who is the most important voice when it comes to Iranian decisions on what to do with the United States, he doesn't want to do anything either. So it's not just the American side that are in this sort of gray zone or limbo. The Iranian supreme leader fundamentally is suspicious of American intentions. He believes even if the Americans promise him heaven, that they are going to quietly do anything they can once they have a chance to remove him and the Islamic Republic. And that's why he's willing to pay this heavy price to keep Iran and U.S. from settling their differences. I mean, when President Trump was asking the Iranians, can I come and visit? I mean, how quickly did the Iranian regime say, no, thank you, we're not interested? I mean, how many countries out there are so quick to turn around and visit by American president? I'm not saying that's what Trump offered, but Trump did send the prime minister of Japan to Tehran with a personal message of let's sit down and see if we can figure out a way to get out of our differences. And quickly, the Japanese Prime Minister Abe came back to Washington after visiting Tehran and said, the Iranians are not interested. The Iranians are not interested, not because the people of Iran are not interested to change the trajectory of the country, because that small group of Iranian leaders that control that country see resumption of diplomatic relations with Washington. And they see the end of anti-Americanism as the end of the Islamic Republic. And that's why they're so fearful of changing course. Otherwise, it actually shouldn't be that hard to resume diplomatic relations. Just of March of last year, Iran and Saudi Arabia resumed diplomatic relations. And the bad blood between Iran and Saudi Arabia isn't that much worse than, say, Iran and the United States. But the Iranian regime doesn't fear Saudi Arabia as a player that can come in and end the Islamic Republic. But the Iranian regime fears that the U.S. has that capacity, and that's why they're keeping the U.S. out.
So to segue into the very last topic that I wanted to talk about, let's say that I was the U.S. president and you were my Iran security advisor or policy advisor. And I guess if I was a slightly hawkish president, I would look at Iran and its alliance with China and sending weapons to Russia, and I would see it as a growing problem for issues all around the world. And I would be tempted by the policy solution of a regime change in Tehran. And I guess the first question I would ask you is, how stable is at the moment the Islamic Republic regime, given the economic issues, given how unpopular it is, and given how the fact that we've seen massive protests not that long ago that had to be really brutally suppressed. Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests. And here's what you can see in the bonus part.
Iran is already in the transition mode. There will be a new leader. And I think right now, if I had to name one country that probably has capacity to shape the succession process in Tehran, that country would be Russia. If this regime continues to repress and split Iranians along ethnic and other sort of lines, there is a danger that the future of the country of Iran as a unitary state might be put at risk.